Often I start a sermon with a story, something from my life, something that's relatable. But today I'm going old school. Today I'm starting the sermon with a definition. Hope. Hope is that power to hold on to the world as it is and as it could be, and to not turn our back on either, no matter what, while knowing that there is something you can do to bridge the gap between. Which means hope is hard work. And that's why most of us, including myself, often settle for one of two knockoff versions that we pretend are hope: optimism and complacency. Let's start with optimism. Do you know what drunk goggles are? Or they're these kind of scientific looking goggles that you put on your eyes and it distorts your vision, like you're intoxicated. I had to wear these while I was in school. We were doing one of those anti-drinking and driving campaigns. And when you put them on, they would, get you to walk the line. And most of us, as we tried to put one foot in front of the other, would fall over. Our vision so disoriented that you couldn't figure out what was really happening. Optimism is like drunk goggles. We put them on and it distorts reality. We think the world is one way when it is actually something else. And we drunkenly step out, convinced that everything will be okay. Even as we stumble, each step challenging the belief that what we see is the truth, and yet we still cling to it, falling over and over again until one day we just don't bother getting up. Now, on the other hand, the other cheap knockoff of hope is complacency. I think of complacency as the combination of the world's worst alarm clock attached to the most comfortable bed. For when it does happen to wake you up, the alarm clock, instead of insisting that you're to leave the comfort of the bed, just whispers to you and says, "Don't worry. Everyone else is just as comfortable as you. What's the rush?" Or maybe even worse, it whispers, "What could you actually do?" Hope lives in the vast chasm where optimism and complacency cannot enter. And if you're like me, I cling to my goggles and pine for that bed because they are luxuries. As theologian Miguel de la Torre reminds us, they're luxuries because of my privilege. For those on society's margins who are forced to the margin, if they are to survive, they have to see reality without distortion. And they cannot stay out of the action because their lives depend on it. Now, I used to love this oft-quoted saying by the Unitarian minister Theodore Parker. Parker was that 19th century abolitionist who preached with a pistol to defend the escaped slaves in his basement. The quote goes something like this. I know you've heard it. "The arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice." MLK echoed it. Barack Obama repeated it. And when I first heard it, I always thought it was a statement of fact. A fact that aligned at the time with my rather naive and optimistic view of humanity and history. But in seminary, I discovered the full quotation from Parker and realized that he was not speaking about facts at all. Here's the full quote. "I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one. My eyes reach but a little ways. I cannot calculate the curve and complete the figure by the experience of sight, but I can divine it by conscience. And from what I see, I am sure that it bends towards justice." This is no statement of fact, not a truth about reality that Parker is conveying, not a verifiable movement towards justice, but rather a statement of faith. That without being able to see the big picture or fast forward into the future, something in Parker's life convinced him that he could divine the arc of what he couldn't see of the universe and saw that it bended towards goodness. This is a statement of faith, not fact. And I know what some of you might be thinking. I'm at a Unitarian Universalist church. I'm a humanist. I'm an atheist. I don't do faith. But to that, I lovingly and respectfully say, yes, you do. We all do. Because faith is trust. And we all, no matter our theological stripes, put our trust in people or values or practices. All of these without empirical proof of their rightness, correctness, or eventual utility. Because we, hate to break it to you, are mere mortals who cannot accurately calculate the curve and trajectory of our own lives, let alone sometimes our own days, let alone the moral arc of the universe. And that's when faith comes in. Faith, the human practice of trusting something. Trusting something to guide us through the whitewater body blows of life and to guide us through the blinding, flashing lights of information overload towards a path that we hope leads to a life of dignity, of wholeness, of beauty, and love. And it's here that there is a trap, a faith trap, that we religious liberals often get stuck in time and time again. For we choose an optimistic faith over a hopeful one. At the vending machine of life, we select optimism or sometimes complacency over and over again because we want to believe that everything will get better and will work out in the end. And when it does, we point it out and say, see, nothing to worry about. We worked hard. Despite the fact that it's probably our privilege that shielded us from the unequal distribution of pain that plagues our world. And when it doesn't work out, when we choose optimism, staking our claim that humanity is just getting better, that a rising tide floats all boats, as we tune out the voices of coastal nations that remind us that sometimes a rising tide means utter devastation, when we choose optimism and war breaks out, when we choose optimism and a pandemic rages and people abandon the call to the common good, when we choose optimism and violence breaks out close to home, when we choose optimism and we see the intractability of our politics, when we choose optimism and we see sectarian violence starting to rise, when we try to choose optimism when trans kids are using as pawns in some sick game to votes, when we try to choose optimism when reproductive freedoms are put in the crosshairs, it is like a gut punch to our soul. Over and over again, and we begin to try to contort ourselves, to try to salvage our optimistic faith that was our foundation. In the past year or so, I have noticed a theme in many of the pastoral conversations that I've had within our congregation, including many people who have not returned to church. Almost to a person, words grasping to convey what they are experiencing. They speak about a wound deep within, a soul wound, of having endured presidencies, pandemics, and insurrections that shattered their faith in humanity. For years, the foundation of their faith had rested firmly on reason and the common good being enough, that the decency of our fellow human beings is enough to bring about a future distinctly better than the present. That even if they wouldn't have said it just like this, they believed that humans were on an upward path towards progress, that sure, there's a few hiccups along the way, but the past 5 years have destroyed that faith. Maybe you yourself might count yourself among those who have that soul wound. Maybe you have retreated into denial or complacency or despair. Maybe you have met this breach of faith with a fierce activist combat to fight the heartache within, to keep optimism on life support. But the evidence keeps pouring in. Chaotic and confusing as it is, impossible to discern, but often impossible to deny its heart-wrenching nature. Sometimes optimism is too heavy a burden to bear, and so we think the only option is to sink into despair. It's time, friends, to leave an optimistic faith behind. We have to untether our faith, our trust, from its boom and bust cycles, the whiplash of hope soaring when things go our way only to be decimated when the arc slams in the other direction. A faith that relies on outcomes must cherry-pick evidence to prevent an inevitable spiral into despair. What we need now, like in every other moment of history, is not to disengage from the truth of this moment or divest ourselves from our responsibility to be part of creating more justice, more beauty, and a more diverse existence. And so we cannot get lost in the world of despair if that means conceding to the forces of evil. Even, and maybe especially when, that despair is justified. We need people who practice hope. The difference between optimism and hope is that optimism says everything's going to be all right. And hope says, I can do something to make that so, to make it more likely that that is so, even slightly, even microscopically. That as Vachel Havel wrote, hope is a dimension of the soul, an orientation of the spirit, an orientation of the heart. It transcends the world that is immediately experienced and is anchored somewhere beyond its horizons. It is not the conviction that something will turn out well. It is from that internal conviction, not drawn from the evidence of the present or the past, but in the internal power contained within life itself to persist and to claim a future, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer would say, to claim a will to a future. That when we untether our hope from results, we join in beauty and regeneration, as the late contemporary Christian mystic Thomas Merton wrote in a letter to a friend, do not depend on the hope of results. You may have to face the fact that your work will be apparently worthless and even achieve no results at all, if not perhaps results opposite to what you expect. As you get more used to this idea, you start more and more to concentrate not on the results, but on the value, the rightness, the truth of the work itself. You gradually struggle less and less for an idea, and more for specific people. And what we are learning about cognitive neuroscience is that we don't need to be hopeful to cultivate hope. That we don't need to feel hope in our hearts. We don't have to think that we can make a difference to grow hope, to grow our hope muscles. Stanford neuroscientist Dr. Andrew Huberman's research found that our beliefs about the world, about ourselves, are constructed not primarily from our thoughts or feelings, but from our behaviors. It's not so much I think, therefore I am, but rather I do, therefore I am. That our identities and beliefs are constructed not from our thoughts and our feelings, but our actions. And so if we want to change our beliefs, our outlook on life, if we want to grow our capacity to hope and spend less time in despair or complacency, we don't need to convince our minds that hope is justified. We don't even need to instill hopeful feelings in our hearts. All we must do is make simple, small, hopeful actions. Exercising our agency. Practicing in tiny ways that we can do something. And not for ideas, but for people. And those actions, small as they might be, demonstrate to ourselves something about life, not optimism, but hope. That we can actually, neurologically, hope with our hands. That hope grows from our hands, even when we don't believe it or feel it, that hope actually doesn't care about our feelings, but rather cares what we do in spite of it. Beautiful things. Hopeful steps. When we feel stuck, we can simply start to move our bodies. And that is even enough. When we feel despair, that feeling of being trapped, that we can't do anything, even the simple decision to move our bodies can train ourselves that we have the power to change something, even if it be our internal state, by our actions. That hope is built in thousands and small microscopic choices and moments when a person holds fast to the knowing that the world doesn't have to be like this and decides to act even in the smallest of ways. The paradox of hope is that we can do hope even if we have abandoned hopefulness. Because suddenly hope doesn't depend on the realities that are outside of our control. Hope is something I can do. Hope is a verb. Hope is an action. We hope with our hands, not our minds or our hearts. And the more I take hopeful actions, the more I prove to myself that I can have an impact, even microscopically. And paradoxically, then, the more hopeful thoughts spring to my mind, and the more my heart is filled with hopefulness. Hope is taking a step, trusting that as we take the step towards the good, that the world changes, that the possibilities conspire, that partners reach out, that life joins us. But most importantly, hope is about the capacity to take the step. So we should stop asking ourselves, is this going to work? And instead ask, is this the right thing for me to do to build hope? And trust that action to work on us. Because as the Reverend Victoria Safford reminds us, our mission is to plant ourselves at the gates of hope. Not the prudent gates of optimism, which are somewhat narrower, nor the stalwart gates of common sense, nor the strident gates of self-righteousness, which creak on shrill and angry hinges, nor the cheerful, flimsy garden gates of everything's gonna be all right, but a different, sometimes lonely place, the place of truth-telling about your own soul first and its condition, the place of resistance and defiance, the place of the ground from which you see the world both as it is and as it could be, as it will be. The place from which you glimpse not only struggle, but joy in the struggle, and we can stand there, beckoning and calling and telling people what we are seeing, asking people what they see. Hope begins with our hands, not our hearts or our minds. And so if you ever feel locked in despair, paralyzed by forces that tell you that nothing you do will matter, remind yourself that these hands are all you need to begin the journey of hope yet again. We hope with our hands, just as we can pray with our feet. We are people of hope, and the world needs us more than ever. Amen, and blessed be.